We are going to continue the description of the bones of the skull. This is the second lecture, second of those series. In the first one, we described the general features of the bones of the skull, together with a developmental background for the embryology of the bones of the skull. In that session, we are going to describe 5 separate bones of the skull, which are the frontal, the occipital, the temporal, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid. We'll go around them to see the main features of each one, and knowing the features of those 5 bones will give a good account and good knowledge about the bones of the skull in general. We'll continue those series. Now let's start by the frontal bone. So starting by the frontal bone. So that's how it looks like, the frontal bone at birth, formed of 2 parts separated by a suture, which we call it early the metopic suture. The frontal bone will have 2 processes and 2 notches. Here we can see the 2 processes, the zygomatic process and the nasal process, with 1 notch here. This is what we call the nasal notch. We'll see in the other one the ethmoidal notch. Here is the anterior fontanelle, and this is what we call it the frontal or the metopic suture. Going to the adult bone, we have the parts of it as the squamous part of the frontal bone. We have the glabella, which is an important point, as we said in the early slide, between the 2 superciliar arches. This area is what we call it the glabella. Then the zygomatic process, the nasal process, the nasal notch, the nasal spine in the middle, and this is what we call it the frontal tuberosity. If you remember, we said in the first lecture that is the site of the primary ossification center of the frontal bone. That is the supratrochlear notch or foramen for the supratrochlear nerve and vessels. And this is the supraorbital notch or foramen. In certain cases, it is only a notch. In others, it is a complete foramen for the passage of the supraorbital nerves and vessels. And this is the superciliary arch of the front of the frontal bone. That is the frontal bone looking from inferior aspect to show some features. So we can see the supraorbital margin, the upper margin of the orbit. We can see the orbital plate of the frontal bone forming the roof or the main part of the roof of the orbit. We can see the ethmoidal notch, where that bone in yellow is the ethmoid bone. When you remove it, there will be a notch, which we call it ethmoidal notch. That's the fossa for the lacrimal gland, where the lacrimal gland will be lying in that fossa. And that is the trochlear fovea or trochila, a cartilaginous piece of cartilage for the tendon of the superior oblique muscle of the eyeball. Sometimes ossified form even a bony trochila instead of a cartilaginous trochila. So for the occipital bone, now. Again, that is the occipital bone at birth, which is formed of three main parts. A squamous part, that is the squamous part of the occipital bone, and basal part, that is the basal occiput or the basal part, and condylar part, where the occipital, this is the condylar or the lateral masses here, which have the condyle for the articulation with the atlas vertebrae. That's how it looks like at birth, as three separate parts joined by hyaline cartilage here, which appears in blue, light blue. That's the occipital bone. As from the external surface of that bone, the main features which you can see on the outer surface or the external surface of the occipital bone is the three nuchal lines. A highest one, the highest nuchal line, a superior one, the superior nuchal line, and inferior one, the inferior nuchal line. We can see also the external occipital crest. On the upper end of it, the external occipital protuberance, the center of it is the inion, as we have said earlier in the first lecture. That is the occipital condyles for the articulation, as we said, with the first cervical vertebrae, the atlas. And there is two condylar canals, one anterior and one posterior. The anterior will give passage to the hypoglossal nerve with some vessels with it. The posterior condylar canal either patent or occluded or closed. When it's patent, it gives passage to an emissary vein, but it is not, even can be found on one side, not on both sides. The other side here have no posterior condylar, but it is found only on the right side. From the internal surface of the occipital bone, what we can see is the groove for the venous dural or dural venous sinuses, which carry the venous circulation inside the skull. That one is for the superior sagittal sinus, which is under the vault of the skull, starting from the most anterior frontal bone down to that position, the internal occipital protuberance. That's the groove for the transverse sinus. That is the basal occiput, the basilar part of the occipital bone here, this part here. And this is the internal occipital protuberance. And this is the internal occipital crest. These are the sites of the occipital bone. Now, the temporal bone, the main features of the. That's how it looks, the temporal bone at birth, being formed of four parts, separate four parts at birth. These four parts are the squamous part, that one here, the mastoid part, the tympanic part, which, as we can see here, the external acoustic meatus or auditory meatus here, and a petrous part over here still under development. For the tympanic part is formed the external auditory meatus represented by a tympanic ring just before development. Here, because the mastoid process does not develop, that stylomastoid foramen will look on the lateral side of the skull, not at the base as in the adult. And this is how it looks like the mandibular fossa at birth. That is the temporal bone, which we say it consists of four parts, all developing separately. These are the parts of it. the squamous, the mastoid, the tympanic, and the petrous or petrostyloid part. That is the parts of the temporal bone. Now we'll look to the temporal bone from the lateral side or outer side, from the inner surface, and from the base of the skull, from three directions or three positions. From the external surface, the main features are the zygomatic process here of the temporal bone, the articular tubercle here, which lies anterior to the mandibular fossa, keeping the head of the mandible in position, the petrotympanic fissure here in the floor of the mandibular fossa, and this will give passage to the chorda tympani branch of the facial nerve. Of course, this is the mandibular fossa. We have seen it before. That is the tympanic part of the temporal bone, which was represented by a ring, as we have seen it in the previous slide. And this is the styloid process here. And this is what called the supramastoid crest. And this is a suprameated triangle. That is an access to the mastoid air cells when there is a source of infection in the mastoid, and surgically you need to interfere with this infection through that triangle, the suprameated triangle. That triangle, as you can see, superiorly by the supramastoid crest, anteriorly by the upper edge of the external odontoclemus, posteriorly by the anterior border of the mastoid process. That's how you outline it on the outer surface of the body. There is a spine here which is called suprameatal spine. This is the mastoid notch over here on the medial surface of the mastoid process, and that is the mastoid process itself. Here is what we call it a tympanomastoid fissure here between the tympanic and the mastoid parts of the bone. That's from the outer surface. If you go to the inner or internal surface of the temporal bone, we have here the main features. That is the parietal notch articulation with the parietal bone. And this is what we call it the mastoid foramen. It transmits an emissory vein which can communicate with the venous sinuses inside the skull. And this is the opening of what called vestibular canaliculus here, with the vestibular process in the inner ear. And this is a groove for the sigmoid sinus, where that emissory vein from this mastoid foramen can communicate with the sigmoid sinus, which will end up by forming the internal jugular vein. That is what we call it the arcuate eminence. It is an elevation on the upper surface of the petrous part of temporal bone. Lateral to it, this region here, usually in the skull, the bony skull, will be fenestrated, will be having some erosion here, because a very thin bone, which call it tegmen tympani, forming the roof of the middle ear. That is the arcuate eminence here. And this is the internal acoustic meatus for the passage of the vestibulocochlear nerve and the facial nerve. And this is the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone. Above the apex here, there is a fossa, which you call it trigeminal fossa here. That trigeminal fossa holds the trigeminal ganglion of the fifth nerve, the trigeminal nerve. And this is the styloid process. Now from the inferior surface, we'll look to the main features, which you can call it also the basal surface. Here we can see the carotid canal. That is the carotid canal, the entry of the internal carotid artery to the cranial cavity. And this is the apex, of course, of the vitreous part of temporal bone. Here is the jugular fossa for the internal jugular vein. And this is the occipital margin where it articulates with the occipital bone. And this is the tympanic part here of the temporal bone. That is the mastoid notch on the inner surface of the mastoid process. This one. And this is what we call it the occipital groove here for the occipital vessels. Again, in the basal surface, we can see the zygomatic process here. We can see the external acoustic meatus. We can see the stylomastoid foramen for the exit of the facial nerve and some vessels. This is the sphenoid margin, where it articulates with the sphenoid. The mandibular fossa is here. Again, the vitreotympanic fissure for the chorda tympani nerve. A cross section, or a vertical section, better to say, in the temporal bone will show some features inside the temporal bone. The temporal bone is a very important bone for containing the hearing process, the middle ear and the inner ear. That's how the human being can hear, through the ossicles found in the middle ear and the chambers in the inner ear. Here in that section, sagittal section, we can see the mastoid antrum, a cavity here. We can see the promontory here. That's the bulging of the semicircular canal in the middle ear cavity. Above and below there is two foramina, as you can see here. The one below is what we call it the cochlear foramen, or fenestra cochleae. The upper one is the fenestra vestibuli. The lower one will contain what we call it the secondary tympanic membrane. Again, it helps in the hearing process. That is the carotid canal here, which appear in pink in the most anterior part of the section. And this is the L-shaped or the curved canal which hosts the facial nerve. As you can see here, that is the exit of the facial nerve to the middle ear cavity. This is the middle ear cavity here. So it's coming from an area, or the canal lies above the vestibule of the middle ear. Then when it comes laterally, it bends backward, as you can see. It's coming from this part here, internal meatus, laterally until that point, and then go backward, forming an angle, which is called genu of the facial nerve. Passing laterally above the promontory, at the roof of the middle ear, it will descend downwards in the posterior wall of the middle ear to come out from the stylomastoid foramen. That is the genu here, and that is the course of the curve of the nerve to come out from the stylomastoid foramen to be in the back of the external auditory meatus. Here is the mastoid air cells, which, as we mentioned earlier, some infection can occur. We call it mastoiditis. As you can see, it is in many spaces here. So it is a complicated infection. To reach those mastoid air cells through suprameatal triangle, which we have described. That is the view of the internal acoustic meatus from inside. Be divided into two areas, upper area and lower area, by the transverse crest. The upper area will have the opening for the facial nerve canal, which start, as we said, to go laterally above the vestibule of the inner ear. Inferiorly, you have what we call it tractus spiralis foraminus, and this is a tract for some canals over here. And there is two vestibular areas, superior and inferior, for the vestibulocochlear nerve. That's how it looks like, the internal trabeatus. Now to the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone at birth also is divided into parts by this hyaline cartilage in blue here. Is again four parts: a body, a lesser wing, a greater wing, and two tergoid processes on each side. It looks like a butterfly. That butterfly has a body, two wings, and two legs here, which are the tergoid processes. That's at birth. In adult, look into it from the front. You can see the lesser wings, the body, that is the body here first, with that opening which leads to the sphenoidal air sinuses, as it appears in the X-ray here, and through that foramen here. And then the two tergoid processes, as we said. And then that is the sphenoidal sinus appearing in the X-ray. From a superior or from above, we can look at the sphenoid bone, that is the body, the lesser wing and the greater wing here, to see the features from above, from superior surface. So we have an articulation with the ethmoid here, we call it the jugum, the most anterior part of the sphenoid. Then we have the optic canal as a foramen in the lesser wing on each side. We can see anterior clinoid process here, two on each side. And as you can see here, the anterior clinoid process with what we call it the tuberculum cilli here, forming a rounded thing opened inferiorly. That is the passage for the internal carotid artery over here on each side. That's the groove for the internal carotid, and it goes forwards and then upwards to leave through that opening, and then goes backwards. Sometimes there is a ligament connecting the body with the anterior clinoid process, forming that or transforming that into foramen, which we call it carotoclinoid canal or foramen. Here we can see the posterior clinoid process on each side again of the dorsum cilli. That is the dorsum cilli here. Between the tuberculum cilli and the dorsum cilli, this is the sella turcica, or the pituitary fossa, where the pituitary gland will be lying over here. Then we can see the foramen spinosum here, which we have seen in the base of the skull in the first lecture. We can see the foramen ovale, and we can see the foramen rotundum here. That is the foramen rotundum, ovale, spinosum. Three of them are found in the greater wing of the sphenoid. And this is what we call it the carotid groove, where the anterior carotid, as we said, will go forwards, then upwards through that carotoclinoid canal, if present, or foramen, or notch now, and then goes backwards. And this is what we call it the foramen rotundum here, rotundum, ovale, and spinosum. Looking from the posterior aspect of the bone, of the sphenoid bone, we can recognize the lesser wing again, the greater wing, between them the superior orbital fissure here. And then we can see the pterygoid fossa, that is the fossa between the two pterygoid plates, the lateral and the medial, lying between the medial lateral two. This is the projecting part of the medial pterygoid, we call it the pterygoid hamulus. Then that is the medial pterygoid, and that is the lateral pterygoid plates holding the fossa in between. That is the way the three parts articulate together, the three bones which we have mentioned. And we have pointed to the notches in each one. So that is the sphenoid bone in the middle, it's a single bone, and two temporal bones on each side, and single occipital bone in the back. That's how they unite or articulate together. Now the last bone is the ethmoid bone. Here on the right side there's a diagram as a coronal section of the skull. On the left side a simulated one, a drawn line drawing for the ethmoid. And for that drawing here, you can see it's formed of a perpendicular plate from top to bottom here, that is the whole thing, and two lateral masses or labyrinths, that is the two lateral, and this is the perpendicular plate. That is how this ethmoid is formed. Go on to the other side, that is the perpendicular plate here, and these are the two lateral masses here. It shares in three cavities. The cranial cavity is here on both sides. The two orbital cavities are here, that is the medial wall of the orbit here, and the nasal cavity is here. So this is the orbit, that is the cranial cavity, that is the nasal cavity here. It has two plates, an orbital plate, this one here, and nasal plate. The nasal plate will carry two conicae, superior and middle conicae. That is the middle conicae here, and that is the superior one. That is the inferior conicae, a separate bone. So, in that diagram, we can see, as I said, the cranial cavity here, the nasal cavity over here, the orbital cavity over here. We can see the orbital plate forming the medial wall of the orbit. We can see the nasal plate forming the lateral wall of the nose, or sharing the formation of the lateral wall, and the perpendicular plate, which is divided part in the cranial cavity above the crista galli, and part in the nasal cavity, part of the nasal septum. So here we are, the crista galli, part in the cranial cavity, that is the on this side and that side also here. Then the cribriform plate of ethmoid, fenestrated part of the bone on each side over here for the passage of the olfactory rootlets of the olfactory nerve. We can see the nasal septum, that is the second part or the lower part of the perpendicular plate, also here, that is the nasal septum here. And we can see the superior conica over here, which is also above here, and a middle conica, which is clear here, and inferior conica, which is, as I said, is a separate bone of the skull. Looking to the sphenoid, to the ethmoid bone, one on the left side, that's an X-ray, a section, a coronal section in the nose, and one on the right side, which is the whole ethmoid bone formed of a perpendicular plate and two labyrinths here, which will contain the ethmoidal air sinuses. That is the perpendicular plate here, crista galli above, nasal septum below, and these are the two lateral, that's the inferior conica, which is a separate bone as we said, and these are the two labyrinthes here. We can see the ethmoidal air sinuses here, anterior, middle, and posterior here. We can see all these features. So that's the crista galli here, and on the other side, that is the cribriform plate of smudge seen in very well here on each side of the crista galli. And the middle conica is here, and the inferior conica is here. And this is the ethmoidal air sinuses, here and here. Then the nasal septum can be seen in the X-ray very clearly, and the two lateral masses or labyrinths on the skeleton on the right side here.